All right. Good afternoon. It's a little past 2 in the Boston area, and we come to you every Saturday with the assembly. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Kwabena Arthur-Kennedy, who is a physician based here in the US, but also a leading member of the New Patriotic Party. He is a medical doctor, but somebody who is very knowledgeable on political issues. Sometimes when I listen to him, I'm amazed at the depth of knowledge with respect to issues of political theory and how some political entities or countries came to exist, especially in the context of the US and Canada. So, Dr. Arthur-Kennedy, we are privileged to have you here today. You're welcome.
Thank you, my brother. And it's a privilege to be here. Greetings to all your viewers and listeners.
Okay. So you started off as a student leader. You were the president of Commonwealth Hall, a hall which I also happen to have gone through. So you are a V-mate. In our days at Commonwealth Hall, one of the challenges was accommodation. So I bounced around a lot of, blocks, we call them. Started off at M Block. The famous M Plaza was my place of residence. And then subsequently, I paired with a friend is at C Block. Third year, paired with another friend at D Block. It was only in my final year that I was assigned a bed to myself. But we had fun in Commonwealth Hall.
We did.
Yes.
I was on J Block for my time there. And I found out that actually an older brother also went to Commonwealth Hall. And I tell people the story that when I first met my high school biology teacher after going to university, she said, "So which hall did they assign you?" I said, "Commonwealth." She said, "We kumaba no." She was so distressed. And 2 years later, when she met me, I was hall president. She said, "How could they make you hall president if you were not like one of them?"
Yeah. But anyway, there's solidarity among members, irrespective of the year you left the hall.
Absolutely.
And which I appreciate a lot. But so you were elected hall president, and you proceeded. You were a medical student and became NUC's president, all right. And subsequently, you were accused of subversion, and you had to leave the country. Took refugee status in Cote d'Ivoire. Returned again, I think 1984, to continue your medical education. And then in 1987, a similar charge was leveled against you. And then you had to go back to Cote d'Ivoire. So I want to, and you guys were very influential in your days as student leaders in terms of national politics. Looking at the terrain today, especially with respect to student leadership, do you see a similar effect coming from our students in terms of influencing policy or even the manner in which our country is conducted? Have these student leaders become stooges of political parties, or how do you see it today?
Yes, things have changed a lot, but to be fair to them, I think that the influence of student leaders and NGOs are inversely related to whether we have civilian or military governments. When we have military governments, student leaders, in addition, of course, to professional bodies and bar association, become de facto opposition leaders. And I think that when there are civilian governments, then that influence wins. Actually, I tell people that I think in 1969, Dr. Buzia was at Legon to address students. And he told them, he said, "I know you'll be disappointed by what I'm going to say about students and politics and all that, but my advice is get a very good profession, be a solid professional, and then focus on politics as a secondary interest." So you can imagine the thinking there. But when there are military governments, of course, de facto, we become, in effect, opposition leaders because we speak for the people who cannot speak for themselves. And actually, during those times, sometimes we are more influential than the politicians.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's move to national politics. And I read your book, Chasing the Elephant into the Bush, which was written in 2009, I think. And it's still very relevant today in terms of the manner in which politics is done. And you mentioned that what motivated you to write the book was because of the depth of first-hand accounts of what happens in politics, campaigns, right? And so you had encouraged, I think, Victor Wusu and Pa Willie to write books, which they didn't. And so you felt it a responsibility to write a book since you were heavily involved. In fact, you had contested the MPP primaries in 2007. You got a single vote. And then subsequently, you became the campaign spokesperson for the Nana Addo campaign in 2008. So reflecting on that experience and where we've gotten to in terms of our democracy, is Ghana's democracy holding?
No, it's not holding. I have gotten a reputation for as consistent with my being a vandal, for speaking my mind and calling things as I see them. Our democracy is in dire straits. And I remember maybe almost a year ago, I wrote an opinion piece that got me a 90-minute interview on Joy FM. And I said that we are not doing well. Why are we not doing well? When you look at the Fourth Republic, it started off very well. There were a lot of court cases and challenges that really deepened our democracy, mainly led by the MPP, transparent ballot boxes, counting votes on the side, people going to court for historic cases about, for example, funding 31st December celebration, which the opposition won. Very good rulings and things that really made one encourage about the strength and independence of the courts. And at least corruption seemed at that time not to be as prominent as it is. Since then, things have only gotten worse, and this is mirrored by Afrobarometer reports that show that there is decreasing confidence in both major political parties and even in politics by most of the public. And I tell people that in actual fact, for the first time since I became an adult, a lot of Africa's youth look admiring at people like Kagame, and other dictators. Remember, even the gentleman who staged the coup in Guinea cited Rawlings as his inspiration. And I think that these things are happening not because people like dictatorship, but people want to get things done and they feel that democracy is not delivering. Rawlings once said that freedom or democracy does not just mean abstract guarantees of freedom of speech, but a roof over your head and a cloth on your back and soap to be able to take a bath and all that. And he's right. Democracy ought to deliver. And this is not just Africa. I think that even when we were student leaders, the reasons why we were able to move the public was not because the public liked democracy. We were tagging democratic grievances onto economic grievances, which resonated with the public. And this is not just unique to Africa. I just finished an 800-page biography of Deng Xiaoping. And on the eve of Tiananmen Square, he told the Chinese leaders he had gathered in a secret place, he said, if we don't crush this rebellion, there will be civil war in China for the next 20 years. And he said, the Communist Party can stay in power as long as it is delivering increasing standards of living and stability for the Chinese people. He said that's the Faustian bargain. As soon as we stop delivering economic growth and stability, then the people will rebel. The people don't necessarily want democracy. They want better lives and they want stability. And that is true all over the world.
So is democracy then the problem, or it's the case that our democracy wasn't properly put together?
Both. I think that democracy per se isn't the problem, but it is how it is practiced. I think that the way, and of course, democracy is very human. Every human being, if you give him or her a chance, would want to say in how he or she is governed. So that, in effect, is the essence of democracy. And when you go and read some of the foundational documents, the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence and all those things, they make it very clear. The question is how you structure things so that the democracy delivers stability and development and rising standards of living. That is why it has been stable in America, for example, because at the end of the day, the system works. And in Ghana, I think that our democracy, as somebody once said when I was in sixth form, my government teacher at Presec, he said, democracy has become the madness of the many for the enjoyment of the few. And that's what is happening in Ghana, that we make noise, we go and vote, and then for the next 4 years, people go and do whatever they want. And as HKP, who is also a fellow Vanda, said, we are practicing Syria one-party states. The MPP wins, and for 4 years, they are a one-party state. And the NDC wins for 4 or 8 years, they are a one-party state. And they do whatever they want. Accountability in parliament doesn't work, and corruption is becoming more and more blatant.
Okay, so if you can point to one thing that is enabling all these deficiencies in the democracy that you just named, what would it be? Because I feel like, for instance, you talk about there's no check on the executive by parliament. And I personally tend to believe sometimes that we've merged the executive and the legislature by requiring that a certain number of the executive should come from parliament. In effect, you've taken away the ability for the executive to hold the legislature to hold the executive accountable away by basically marrying the two.
It's a valid point, but I think that we have become, I call it, we process or processorize every problem. Whenever you mention a problem, our reflex is to talk about constitutional reform or a new law, a new institution. The problem is the people. Let's face it. Parliament has 275 members. Let us even suppose, and it's never been the case, that there are 25 ministers from Parliament. That leaves 250 MPs who are not ministers to be able to, in effect, hold the government to account. But what happens is that has become an excuse. So the 25 who are ministers, of course, are loyal to the president. The rest of the governing party are hoping that they will be ministers the next time. In essence, our problem is not constitutions or laws. I point out, and people are surprised, the US Constitution, together with the Articles of Confederation and all its amendments, is 103 pages. Ghana's Constitution is about 300 and something pages. And yet DS has covered all this big landmass for all these years and been stable. Remember when we were talking about corruption, somebody got the bright idea that we need to get a special prosecutor. I told people that will get nowhere, because if the president intended to fight corruption, he will name his best anti-corruption person as the attorney general, and the person will fight corruption. So whenever we see this, and remember under Kufuor, he said, oh, let's do public procurement authority, so that, all these monies that people take under the table, public procurement authority hasn't done anything about corruption. Indeed, Nanado's first director of public procurement actually formed a private company, took contracts on the side and sold it to people. So our problem is not the constitution or the institutions or the laws or whatever. It is people. I am saying that when you have a president who is willing to fight corruption. Like if you see Buhari,
Mm-hmm.
Buhari's body language projects a man who is against corruption. I do not think Nanado's body language projects the image of a person who is against corruption.
Okay. So, but I mean, you brought up the United States and the fact that their constitution is relatively small, but I mean, they have a perfect, maybe near perfect superstructure. So I am also of the opinion that even if we have a room-sized constitution, it may not be able to address the problems that Ghana has. But the problem might be that the superstructure itself is not coherent enough, right? Sometimes you may have to have a system that has certain inbuilt corrective feedbacks. But in my opinion, ours they were fitted together haphazardly rather than like a jigsaw puzzle.
It's a reasonable point, but respectfully, the American system is not perfect at all. I mean, in actual fact, their constitution was so defective that for it to come into effect, they had to pass 10 amendments with the constitution at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
After that, they found out, for example, that they thought political parties were a bad idea. They had to do an amendment permitting political parties. The president and vice president didn't used to run on the same ticket. They had to change that. So they've had to change a lot of things. And actually, the Americans, I think, I admire their system a lot, but I think it's the separation of powers and the checks and balances, and it is also about people who owe allegiance to constitutions rather than to people. You look at, for example, Marbury versus Madison's ruling in 1803 about the fact that it is the province of courts to pronounce on whether or not laws are constitutional or not. Those kind of things have been assertions. In actual fact, the first time a 16th president died, there was a debate about whether the vice president could succeed him or he was only acting. So they too have had to adjust and to learn. But I think at the end of the day, they have been ruled by patriots, people who put the nation first for a long time. And even now, the tradition has always been that in America, you don't go into politics to make money. You make money and then you go into politics to render service to your country. In actual fact, somebody like Thomas Jefferson spent his own money trying to maintain standards while he served America abroad and back at home. And when he died, he was almost bankrupt, which is why he didn't free his slaves as compared to, say, George Washington. So I am just saying that the institutions and systems matter, but it is also the desire of the people to build a great country and their selflessness, the idea to put country first. I think that if you want to understand the American ethos, I think it probably goes down to John Kennedy's inaugural when it says, "So my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I think by and large, with a few, of course, detours, most of the time, Americans look to serve the bigger interests of their country, whilst in Ghana, our democracy has degenerated into a cabal of criminals who every 4 years contest for power, and when they get power, the main preoccupation of governance is to transfer public resources into private hands so that people can be enriched privately. That is why individuals are getting richer and richer, and the country as a whole gets impoverished every year.
Okay. So, but I mean, how then can we address this? Because Aristotle once said, if citizens were angels, there would be no need for government. But what you are professing right now is essentially to have government, basically angels, run Ghana for it to be successful.
Well, I think to say angels will be a little, what do they call it, too far-fetched. We don't have angels on earth, but I am just saying that we must have people. I think that by and large in Ghana, I think there are too many people in our governance and our society who put their party before the country. I think that we need more people who will say my country it is of thee. That whenever the interest of their party collides with the interest of the country, they will pick the country. That doesn't mean perfect people, but it means that people who, by and large, try to do the best that they can by their country. And
Okay.
we've had citizens, like that throughout our history. Not many, but there've been some. You know, I joke with people that the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, who the Brown from taking over lands. If it was this time, most of the lawyers who have gone for juicy pieces of land, and that would have been the end of, you know, I mean, Justice Aban, who refused to collude with a champion in the Unigov referendum, you know, Ephraim ringing call to patriotism long before the country was born. Nkrumah's, whatever you think of him, his selflessness, so there have been patriots, but I think we need more of them, and we need more love for our country as compared to love for our parties and for our families.
Okay. So you bring up political parties, and do you think they are holding our democracy hostage? Because, for instance, I think earlier in the year, we saw the NDC leadership or executive change parliamentary leadership. We saw a similar thing with respect to the NPP. Have we given political parties too much power over how democracy is conducted in our country, such that you have to be loyal to political parties? Otherwise, you probably do not have a political future.
Well, yes and no. Um, yes, indeed. I think that political parties should not be picking the leaders in parliament. And as an example, if you recall, Trump just won an election here, and the Republicans just picked their Senate majority leader. Going into the vote, Trump, through his allies, made it very clear that he preferred a senator from Florida. And the senators just decidedly voted against him and gave it to somebody else, because they don't want somebody who is not in the Senate to come and tell them who the Senate majority leader should be. In the same way, it's not just in this republic, and the examples you refer to, I remember in 1970, 80, 81, there, we had this problem in the PFP when Vito Wusu changed parliamentary leaders in affecting Kwekuba and other. I think that the members of parliament should vote for their own leadership. Having said that, when you say that if you don't owe allegiance to the party, you don't have a good future. Interestingly, I once met Esiedun Ketia and late Kwabena in the company of McMenu and Ohininto. This was early 2009, and Mills had been in government for barely 4 months. And the two NDC leaders were saying, look, these presidents, once you elect them, they don't respect the party. So they were talking about MPP and NDC collaborating so that there will be South African style reform, so a party can recall a president, just like South Africa's ANC recalled Mbeki.
Okay.
So of course this shows that the parties don't think they have as much influence as you and I think. But having said that, I think the parties have too much power, and I think it will be a breath of fresh air if another party could become viable or independence could become viable, because it will make the parties look over their shoulders, so there will be no impunity. I think three viable parties in which most of our elections go to a second round and people have to negotiate for endorsements would actually make our political parties more accountable.
Okay. But that brings us back to the system that we are operating. I think with the type of democracy that we are operating, it naturally devolves into a two-party system. And so if we are expecting a third force, perhaps, then we're talking about reforms here.
Well, I don't know that you necessarily need reforms. For example, if Ayariga's party picked up, say, 10 seats from parliament, or if you remember, the first time Rawlings won, he did that in partnership with a small party called Egle. And there have been these kind of small alliances. I just think that it would be better if one of the smaller parties were, say, as strong as the NDP in Canada, you know, or some of these other parties in, say, Britain or France, which can take an election to the second round, so there is no outright winner.
Yeah, but I think the European system is quite different. It's just the way, in some cases, it's proportional, and so no matter what happens, the smaller parties will normally get some seats, right? The complete parliamentary system that we practice may not enable smaller parties to get seats.
Well,
and that might be the challenge for us.
Which is true, but I remember Samia Nkrumah did get a seat. Remember,
Yes.
There was a time when the MPP, in alliance with the CPP, had Indum, in our cabinet after they won. So there are stirrings of that, and I just think that that were to happen, it will be to the benefit of our democracy. But I hear you. I know about the European system, and for example, the Israeli system is such that it emphasizes power for small parties. Even though they have a 120 seat in the set, every party that gets, I think, 1% is entitled to a seat. The idea being that you empower the smaller parties.
Yeah. Okay. And then, in your book, you talked about, in fact, one of the reasons you gave for the failure of the MPP in the 2008 election was the introduction of money into politics. You felt that the MPP folks at the time lived ostentatious lifestyles, and beyond that, during the presidential primaries that was held on Legon campus, there was just open display of money in a way that was obscene, and got a backlash from the public by way of them losing the election. Do you still hold a similar view in terms of the public's repulsion towards the open show of money in elections?
Yes, the problem is that the public has a schizophrenic view towards money. They condemn it and they take it, and at the end of the day, that actually is part of our problem. I actually have been strengthened in my view that money has had a destructive effect on our politics. If you remember, even under Nado recently, when they were appointing DCEs, there were DCE nominees who went to pay money, lost, and were complaining. Some paid money and won. If going to pay people who are going to confirm you as a DC is not bribery, I don't know what else is. And if we permit that, why would we be surprised that the winner of that DC contest is going to go and give contracts to get his money back? So I think that we need to be able to check these things because they are blatantly corrupt and they corrode the very core of our democracy. You cannot say that you run. And actually, recently, a few years ago, I think Manasseh's book, he reported that the chief of staff has been sending money to parliament in respect of nominees. This is not official money, under the table money. If we're doing things like this, how are we surprised that our democracy is going nowhere? I remember when MPP MPs said they didn't want Ken Ofurata, a businessman walked on the floor of cabinet of parliament with cash, and up to today we haven't heard anything about that. So if we permit these things, then it is a little bit of a double standard to turn around and bemoan the fact that our system is corrupt. It is corrupt because we all look the other way when the corruption is going on.
Okay. So what would be the corrective measure here? Because all I hear is we complain, the public complains, yet somehow we all know the individuals who have amassed wealth unduly. What is the corrective measure here? What are we supposed to do?
The corrective measure is for institutions to do their jobs. And actually, the corrective measure you mentioned goes all the way to Galamsey. I think the only reason that I have a little bit of hope, diminishing hope, is that if we blunder into one good president, Ghana will change forever.
Okay.
Because the office has so much power that a good person can do a lot of good. And I think that unfortunately, all the institutions on paper that are supposed to fight corruption look to the presidency for their marching orders. So nobody does what they are supposed to do unless they think the president wants them to do it. So, for example, these DCEs who paid bribes and were either voted for or not voted for, nothing prevented the IGP from arresting some of them and saying, come talk to us about who you paid money to and why you did that. That, for example, will have had a very salutary effect on our corruption system. So the thing that is happening with Galamsey, you know, I mean, nothing should stop the IGP or somebody from going to say, oh, we are all Ghanaians, you are polluting our rivers and whatever. So come and tell us why you are doing that. No, so there are all these example after example. Look at Celia Dapa finding
Yeah.
so much money in her home, and nobody did anything about it. You know, I mean, at the minimum, if this was the US, people would be asking you to come and explain how you came by that.
Yeah. Okay. So, but you brought up Galamsey. Let's go into that. What do you think should be sort of the immediate measure to address the Galamsey problem?
I think none of the political parties on their own will solve Galamsey, because if you are perceived to be solving it, the other party will use it to get votes at your expense. So we need a bipartisan approach. I think it should probably be brokered by the Asantehene and the Speaker of Parliament, withdraw the bill that Parliament passed in the middle of the night to give all these people rights to concessions and all that, repeal that, ban Galamsey for about 3 years while we look at where we are and the environment can recover. Make sure that everybody is banned from getting to the water bodies. I don't understand how Chansan machines are being brought in. These are not things you can hide in your pocket. They are big machines. So I can't see how they get in and nobody knows how they got in. So these are things that we should stop as a national priority, because I don't understand how the love of money can let people get to a point where pregnant women are drinking mercury impregnated water and they are going to give birth to deformed babies. 80-year-olds trying to amass fortunes and destroying their country in the process. What are they going to do? Take the money with them into their graves? This is an existential threat to our nation. And by the way, China, whose citizens are doing all this to us, produces more gold than any other country on earth, and the environment is clean.
Yeah.
So does US, so does Canada, so does South Africa.
Okay.
The South Africans last week on BBC are trying to deal with illegal mining, and the security forces are very upfront there and applying pressure to try and stop it.
Yeah. Well, I'm also for an immediate outright ban of Galamsey. But let's move on to freedom of speech. You were a victim of the lack of freedom of speech during the military regimes. The MPP as a political party, I think, also gained its renown for fighting for freedom of speech. Nanado as a president or as a political figure benefited from that struggle. He led a Kumupreko demonstration that resulted in the loss of lives. But as we currently speak, the perception is that he is not a president who values freedom of speech. I don't know what your opinion is on this matter.
It shouldn't be a perception, it's a reality.
Okay.
He has been anti-freedom of speech. His government have harassed media people. People have had to leave the country for some time, I think, including Manasseh. People have had to stop covering politics because they are afraid for their lives and others. You know, Nanado, surprisingly, has not been a friend of the freedoms that he championed as a human rights lawyer.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about a recent issue in Parliament, and this was with respect to the vacation of certain seats. The order was given by the Speaker of Parliament, and usually there's a certain argument, there's certain historical context that is given to that regulation that MPs cannot cross carpets. I generally do not believe in that principle, but I don't know what's your position on that matter.
Yeah, MPs should not cross carpet because it undermines the stability of our system, and that experience comes from Nkrumah's time. When the opposition was gutted by luring people with jobs to help them cross carpet. I think the current situation, though, is a little tricky. So whenever I talk to people about this, I say, let's go back to the Rawlings-Acker incident, if you remember.
Yeah.
Rawlings's vice president was Acker. And then about 6 months to an election, Acker had agreed to be on Kufuor's ticket as Kufuor's running mate, and he was going to run against Rawlings. I think that if you apply the current interpretation, which says that, the desire to contest on a different ticket is for the next parliament, so we shouldn't do anything about it under this parliament, we are not being practical, because what we are saying is that Rawlings then should have continued to trust Acker to sit in his most intimate discussions, even concerning his campaign. Human nature being what it is, that is really not a reasonable point. So, for example, if an MPP MP is picked by, say, Mahama, this time, say, Napo, if Napo had been picked by Mahama as his running mate, and Napo is still an MP for the MPP, and they are sitting down plotting strategy, you telling me that the MPP should trust him to sit in their strategy plotting? Yes, indeed, it is for the next parliament, but for practical purposes, I think it is reasonable for them to think that they cannot count on his loyalty. Having said that, I think that Michael Quay's thing about the parties should come and ask for a person to be dismissed is really not on. Because if you did that, it means that in the same parliament, some parties will come and complain about their people who said they are leaving and other people won't. So that some MPs who have left can stay, but some who have... No, we need to have the same standard. So I actually think that the speaker's ruling, if you look at the precedent that had been set by Michael Quay, was reasonable, but on substance, you could debate it. But having said that, I think that the Supreme Court's conduct was unseemly. The idea that somebody can file, what do they call it, an ex parte motion about an offense that hasn't even occurred, and the Supreme Court will entertain it, as Judge Tanko, Supreme Court Justice Tanko said, then the Supreme Court has become like an advisory society from whom people can seek opinions. Courts do not offer opinions, they deal with actual cases. And it is really unfortunate that the Supreme Court tarnishes reputation that way. That was not the first time they had done that. They colluded with Nanado by their silence and contributed to the sacking of Domilovo. That, for example, was unpatriotic because they all knew that what the man was doing wasn't okay. They lent their hand in the changing of the guard at the YC. I think these things undermine confidence in our judiciary. That is why Kandapa said that if our side wins too much, it's not good. Mahama said we need to decide this election on the streets. We won't take it to court. Those things are clear indications that the Supreme Court is losing the confidence of the public.
So the Supreme Court, and it's a very complex conversation to have, given how central the Supreme Court is to the existence of our democracy. But as you have stated, I mean, they have given many rulings and conducted themselves in a way that, as responsible citizens, we need to comment on. Do you think the court is too big? Do we need to set a certain minimum number of a maximum number of judges
Yes,
as a way of yes?
Yes, we do. I think even without a constitutional amendment, Parliament can pass a law capping the number of Supreme Court judges. But while they are at it, I think we need a lot of judicial reforms. For example, the parliamentary law on judicial reform, just like the US Judiciary Act, can lay out the parameters for appeals, time limits, the composition of panels. I do not think the composition of panels should be left to the discretion of the Chief Justice, so that she can just go into her bedroom and emerge with panel A. Then in the middle of panel A sitting, she will decide that she wants to pull two people off panel A. That sounds medieval. We are a modern country, so we shouldn't leave that in her hands. Even good people given so much discretion start doing mischief with it. Then when cases get to the courts, we should have defined time limits. And actually, I'm also not for this idea of only a panel sitting on a Supreme Court case, and if you like all of them, you have to appeal and it costs more money. We need to know that opinions of the Supreme Court are opinions of the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
So if you think about it, the last time 5 people ruled, then the Chief Justice brings 2 more to make it 7, and the 2 additional justices dissented. So if it was 15 and the new 10 all dissented, it means it would have given us a different opinion. We will never.
Yeah, so we're not getting the true decision of the court.
Yes.
It's only at any given moment, it's only a section of it.
Yeah,
right.
Picked up by the Supreme Court Chief Justice, whatever reasons appear to her sufficient.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move to the elections. What do you think about the MPP's ticket? I mean, you were involved in the 2008 election. I read your book about the process of selecting a vice presidential candidate, and it seemed like history repeated itself this time around with respect to Bawumia. It was evident that he was struggling to get a running mate. And so far, I think the public verdict is that he doesn't have the best running mate.
Well, the running mate thing is always the decision of the candidate. I think that Bawumia did better than Nada did. Nada picked Bawumia, who wasn't even a member of the MPP. Napo is a member of the MPP, whatever you think of him. So in that sense, he's qualified to be a running mate. Would I have picked him if I was Dr. Bawumia? No, I wouldn't, but I wasn't the presidential candidate. Having said that, of course, you can also argue about whether John Mahama picked the best running mate. There are people who thought that other people may have been better. So there are always second guessing. Even in the US, there are people who felt that Trump shouldn't have picked J.D. Vance. There are people who felt Kamala shouldn't have picked Governor Walz. And people have opinions on both. I think in the long run, Vance turned out to be a better pick than Governor Walz, but that's another matter. So these things are always personal choices by the candidate, and we need to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. The election is in 2 weeks. What do you think this election holds for the future of Ghana's democracy? Is there a particular direction that you think, if it goes, it might not augur well for the democracy, or you think that any way it goes, it doesn't matter?
That depends on the process. As long as it is free and fair, and the votes are counted well, then whoever won, it helps our democracy. I hope that, unlike the last time when there was the Techiman 8 who lost their lives and nobody has said anything, there will be no loss of lives. As Goodluck Jonathan poignantly put it, nobody's political ambition is worth a drop of any Nigerian's blood. So I hold that view that nobody's ambition is worth a drop of any Ghanaian's blood. And I also hope we don't do a mistake like Sal, which deprived the people of Santrofia, Pafululubi, and Lipe of representation in parliament for 4 long years, which of course the Supreme Court didn't think needed intervention. But this one, when people were going to lose representation for a few months, that needed intervention. So I think the election depends on the process. As long as the process is transparent, people vote in peace, the votes are counted, and a winner is declared without having to resort to court, it will be a success.
Okay. So, I mean, and let's conclude here. What is the way forward for our democracy? Because I mean, we've spoken a lot about what is wrong with it. We have a leadership crisis. You also talk about the people. Do we need an overhaul in terms of the social engineering of the entire Ghanaian citizenry towards a better future, or what is really the diagnosis here?
The diagnosis is a lack of leadership.
Okay.
This idea of re-engineering Ghanaian society, no society has ever been transformed. You know, Ghanaians get on planes every day. They show up in London, Washington, New York, what do they call Düsseldorf. The next day, they show up to work on time. They obey the traffic rules. They become outstanding citizens. We produce excellent doctors and engineers. The problem is not Ghanaians, because the same people who leave Ghana and do all these exceptional things. The problem is leadership. If we have good leadership, Galamsey will stop. If we have good leadership, there will be development. If we have good leadership, we will not be taking bribes to elect DCs. All that goes to leadership.
Okay. Well, Dr. Arthur-Kennedy, look, there were a lot of issues that we touched today that I wished we could have delved deeper into. And I hope by appearing here the first time, you've become a friend of the show. And if I call upon you at any time, we can dig deep into some of the issues that we talked about today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish you well, and my greetings to your audience.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank
We
you.
meet.
We meet.
All right.